Without further ado, let's get into it. I'm pleased to introduce our presenter today, Steve Ives. Steve has worked as a technical consultant and trainer for Synergex since 1997, developing e-commerce applications and helping companies maximize their vertical market software applications. Steve has experience with networking, building and managing internet connections with security firewall solutions. All right, take it away, Steve.
Okay, welcome to the Synergy DE product update and roadmap session for the 2021 DevPartner conference. At the last conference, we released our 10.3.3F, and since then, we've been very busy, as you can see on this slide. So really, I'm going to focus on what's new, primarily since the version 11. Yes, there was the 10.3.3G release that sort of snuck in at the end there, but I'm really sort of focusing on what's happened since version 11, and also that we've had some policy changes internally that I want to share with you. And then towards the end of the session, we'll talk about the product roadmap. So Synergy 11, the primary focus on Synergy 11 really was a continuation of some things that we started in Synergy 10, where we, you'll be aware, we put a big amount of effort into enhancing ISAM in Synergy 10, and that indeed continued in Synergy 11. So we've tried to be focusing really on ISAM, improving reliability and performance wherever we can across the board. It's becoming very obvious that downtime is becoming critical for a lot of organizations these days, and that high availability, getting as close as possible to 24/7 by 365 computing is becoming very important to a lot of people. We're trying to do whatever we can to make ISAM more resilient to failure, and easier to recover from failure when things do go wrong, as they ultimately will from time to time. When it comes to ISAM, the ISUtil utility, or ISUTL, is a key enabling technology that a lot of focus has gone into over recent releases. And this is one area in particular that we've really focused and tried to improve performance, especially when processing and dealing with very large files. And we have made some very significant improvements in that area. One of the new features that's been added to ISAM is a new setting called Resilient ISAM, which can be applied on a file-by-file basis. Resilient ISAM files allow index corruption to be detected and recovered from while the file is in use, which is obviously a major step forward. You can add this feature to an existing file. The file does have to be patched to be the latest ISAM revision in order for this to happen. But once it is, you can use the ISAM util -p-q file equals resilient. As you can note from the slide here, this was added in 11.1.1d. Once a file is resilient, then every time that file is opened, be it from a local runtime or via XF server, a check is done to determine whether the index of that file is out of sync. And if it is, it can one of two things can happen. It can either be reported through a runtime error that you can detect and deal with, and in which case you can go and manually recover that file using the ISUtil-s command line. You also have the option, if you have XF server available on the system, to perform an automatic recovery. So if the file open detects that the index is out of sync and XF server is found to be present and configured for automatic recovery, which is a new option when you start XF server, then the runtime will communicate with XF server and have XF server perform that index resync automatically. I should note that you don't need to be using XF server to access the data file in order for this to happen. You can simply be using a local runtime, but you have to have XF server sitting there in the background on the default port of 2330 for that to happen. Of course, because rebuilds can also happen in real time now, you can also choose to perform an index rebuild for index performance enhancement via the ISUtil-r-l option. And again, you can now do that while the file is in use. It uses a new coordinated locking mechanism that's been added to allow it to rebuild those indexes while the file is in use. There's also, this was added slightly later in 11.1.1d, a new file option called Full Resilient. So Full Resilient, again, is another file creation option that you can specify when you create the file. And what Full Resilient does essentially is it causes all of the same benefits of resilient, but in addition, write operations to the IS1 file, the IS1 file being the data file, are immediately written straight through to disk. That is not the case with the index. We're avoiding some overhead by not flushing the index through to disk because it can always be recovered in real time now while the file is in use. But by flushing the data partition to disk on every write, that gives you a higher level of resilience to failures. Of course, when you're doing that kind of thing, there's always going to be a trade-off with performance to a certain degree. If you are one of those organizations that has very large data files that take a long time to recover from, and if the ability to get up and running in the rare occasion that things do go wrong is important to you, then there's a lot of things you can do to make life better and to make your experience better. And that is basically around providing the right environment to run the ISUtil utilities in. Make sure you're using fast storage. SSD storage is relatively cheap these days, even at the enterprise level of hardware these days. If you must use hard disk drives, then at least make sure you defragment regularly and spread the IOs over as many physical devices as you can. Certainly when you are trying to do file recovery, make sure you're working on local files, not across any kind of network. Make sure you're using multiple core CPUs. The ISUtil utility is a multi-threaded application that will deal with reindexing individual keys on different threads at the same time. Make sure you've got plenty of memory available, the more the better. Make sure you've also got adequate free space. If you're going to be recovering very large files, you're going to need very large amounts of free space, at least the size of the file again, and possibly some more. And ideally, give yourself the best chance of getting great performance by spreading the load across multiple fast SSD devices. ISUtil lets you nominate different locations for the storage of temp files and sort files and things like that. So make sure you're doing that to get the best performance possible. Another new thing that was introduced along with Synergy 11 was Rev 11 licensing. Rev 11 licensing is a new distribution mechanism for product keys on all of the supported platforms apart from OpenVMS, where license packs are still used. Rev 11 licensing is built into Synergy version 11, so you get Rev 11 along with Synergy 11. And you can opt to use it with some older versions of Synergy, certainly all of the 10 versions and back to 953B if you wish. Rev 11 licensing doesn't impact in any way the way your local licensing works. You still have a local license server process running, and your runtime instances still obtain their licenses from that license server process. Rev 11 licensing is simply a mechanism for distributing new product keys to your license servers, for example, for annual subscription renewals or installation of new systems and so on. So it simply simplifies the process of getting new systems up and running, making changes, and applying annual updates. I'm not going to go into a lot more detail here because we've covered this extensively in other videos recently that you can view on our YouTube channel if you wish. Let's focus on traditional Synergy for a little while. That's what a lot of people are interested in. What have we specifically done there in version 11? Lots and lots of things. For example, we now have support for extension methods in traditional Synergy. We've had that support in .NET for some time now. Mentioning the string class, we've also enhanced once again the string class in traditional Synergy runtime. We've added several new methods. I won't list them all, but you can see them, the is null or empty and trim and remove and so on. So we've added several new methods and operations on the traditional Synergy string class. In addition to extending the string class, we've also added a new string builder class. And this is particularly useful when you're trying to build a complex string from multiple individual pieces. The next new thing we've added is a new hatNameOf function, or data reference operation, actually. This allows you to refer to the name of an entity in a class, for example, the name of a property or the name of a method at runtime. The point is that it's refactor safe. We've also added some base 64 encoding and decoding support into traditional Synergy. More and more external APIs and web services, for example, are demanding that we do things with base 64 encoded strings. So there's a new data encoding class that's built into the Synergy runtime that can allow you to complete those operations. We've also made some small visual enhancements on the Windows platform. So in Synergy Windows and UI Toolkit specifically, we've improved the sizing logic on various elements, including things like toolbars, and made some improvements in support for high DPI monitors. So traditional Synergy and Toolkit code in particular should look a little bit better these days on those high DPI monitors. We also changed the styling that we use underlying in the runtime from Windows XP style to Windows 7 style. Also, the debugger, essentially the traditional Synergy debugger, was pretty much rewritten. And that's bringing benefits across all platforms. There are some new things. The debugger is now a lot more capable than it ever was, particularly in the areas of examining objects and properties and array list collections and things like that. But these benefits are across all platforms, but particularly roll forward to some dramatic improvements in performance when debugging traditional Synergy through the Visual Studio development tools and debugger. More Synergy 11 enhancements, some other things that we've introduced. We added something called global I/O hooks. We've had I/O hook support for some time. An I/O hook is something that allows you to, for example, on a channel to a data file, say, if a new record is created in this file, run this code, that kind of thing. It's heavily used in things like our SQL replication code, for example. It's a way of trapping whatever happens in ISAM, let's make it happen in the relational database. The previous I/O hooks always required that you go and edit your code and find, essentially, if you were trying to hook into all operations on an order file, for example, you would have to find in your application everywhere that file was opened and go and add a line of code to add those I/O hooks to that channel. Global I/O hooks let you simply put a specific named subroutine in one of your libraries somewhere, and the runtime will detect it and will call it for you, and you can then add your I/O hooks in that routine. So you can literally now hook the I/O system but simply by adding a subroutine. You don't have to change any of your existing code at all. The HTTP API has also been enhanced. More and more people calling RESTful web services these days from traditional Synergy, and more people are coming across requirements to do things like HTTP head operations and patch operations. So we've added those specific to HTTP methods into the API. We also found that more and more HTTP 1.1 services were returning data through something called chunked encoding, which is something that where essentially the data being returned is broken down into multiple chunks and returned in individual operations. And that's something we didn't support in the previous API. You would have to drop back to HTTP 1.1 to get support for that. And now you don't have to do that anymore. We've also enhanced various operators in DBL. We've now fully got support for the ternary operator. The ternary's been there for quite a while now, but there were a few circumstances where it didn't work well. Now it should work fully in all cases. And we've now got new null conditional and null coalescing operators as well. So following along from, just trying to follow along with what's happening in the .NET world and keeping up with those latest trends and latest ways of doing things. Also in the SQL connection world, we've added support for MySQL. It says here MySQL 8. I think we also support an earlier version of MySQL as well. That was added in the D patch. More in Synergy 11. We've added support for OpenSSL 1.1.1. This is really essential if you want to keep up with, if encryption of any kind is important to you, then really you need to keep up with the latest versions of OpenSSL at all times. And that in turn means you have to keep up with the latest versions of Synergy at all times. So this is support for the latest version of OpenSSL. And like I say, if you need OpenSSL 1.1.1 for TLS 1.2, then Synergy 11 is where you need to be. We've also enhanced the encryption algorithms that are used throughout various of our products. So in everywhere that we do encryption, you can see them listed there on the second bullet, HTTP, XF server, and so on. We now default to using TLS 1.2 encryption. We do still support TLS 1.1 encryption, although TLS 1.1 and 1.0 are no longer considered secure. So you can do TLS 1.1 still, but it's not recommended. And we no longer support using TLS 1.0 at all. You can't achieve that with the version 11 products. XF Server and XF Server Plus, also another change that was requested by some of our corporate users was that we wanted the ability to run those products without requiring the main process to run with root permissions. So it's now possible to start those products using non-root user accounts. Other things that have changed in Synergy 11, we did a bunch of work back in the day. It was released in the G release to give us some Spectre and Meltdown mitigation in both the Windows and Linux runtimes. So obviously that gives it, by building with those new C compiler options, it gives us protection against those things, but at the cost of some performance. So at the same time as that, we did a whole round of performance enhancement and just tried to eke out performance improvements in the runtime in various areas wherever we could. And we were fairly successful at that. So, even though we've turned on the Spectre Meltdown mitigation options when building the product, which does slow things down, we've managed to claw back a lot of that through just general improvements. We've also improved the Windows installations. You will all have noticed, if you've seen any of the recent installs, that they all now have a completely different look and feel. They're all built with the Wix product set instead of the old Install Shield products. And our 64-bit installers now deliver 100% of 64-bit code, so that you can successfully run those installations on server systems that only have 64-bit subsystems available. Our installations do continue to be embeddable in your own installations through the same mechanisms as previously, but because of the change to Wix, some of the command line options did change. So if you do embed our Windows installations in your own Windows installer installations, you might need to review the command line options that you issue when you're launching our MSI files. Another change that we made to some of the server products, both XF Server and XF Server Plus, we've added the ability to save and restore XF Server Plus and XF Server service configurations. So you can export the current configurations to a file, and you can import those configurations back from a file. That is doable through, on Windows, the synconfig utility has some new import-export buttons, and there is a new export and import command line options on our Cindy utility as well. Let's talk about DBL integration with Visual Studio a little bit. Basically, this is an ongoing process. We are constantly working on the Visual Studio enhancement. Some of the main areas that we are always focused on, you can see on the screen here, the editor, the build system, and the debugging environments. Every week we're looking at improving those things. We have made some pretty significant strides forward in recent versions. We managed to add support for error and warning adornments, or what most of us call red and green squigglies, that sort of give you a warning in the editor that there's a problem with the code before you actually go and try and do a build. We also added support for collapsible regions in the editor window for many of the multi-line statements. So things like begin, end, using, end using, try catch, those statements that have multiple lines potentially can now be collapsed. You'll see a little plus minus next to them, and you can collapse them down to a single line of code. Also, we've had go to definition support for quite some time via a key sequence. We've now added the ability to use mouse clicks. I believe the default is control click, or I could be wrong on that. You can change it also, so that you can do mouse click based go to definition. The build system, we've made very significant steps forward. It's an ongoing effort. We're still trying to constantly improve things. Then one of the major things we changed is the way that we do dependency builds. We changed it considerably so that it's now based on only when external interfaces change. So this has dramatically improved the scenario where you change something in an ELB, for example, and you wind up rebuilding a whole bunch of DBRs because the ELB changed, even though it was only an internal change in a subroutine or a function. We now detect that, and we only fire off the build of the programs when a new routine is added or a parameter changes or a return value or something like that. We've also added support for doing parallel builds, and we've also added support for a new MS build option called /graph. This was a specific customer request, which basically improves that parallel build performance, but only at the very high end. The debugger is also in Visual Studio significantly enhanced across the board in all debugging scenarios, particularly with traditional Synergy debugging, but not exclusively, but taking advantage of the rewrites of the traditional Synergy debugger. So debugging is in much better shape. We've also improved the quick info. Quick info is the hover over, when you hover over a variable or something or a parameter and get information. We've also made some improvements in that area, so you can get much more detailed and much more accurate information in many cases. In further changes to DBL integration for Visual Studio, we've also added support for a recent new feature that Microsoft added in the product, which is filtered solution load. This is really cool, actually, especially if you've got very large solutions with large numbers of projects. What it essentially allows you to do is, using a command line option, you can, or actually I believe there's a checkbox in the UI as well. When you open a solution, you can elect to open the solution with all projects unloaded. So the solution loads up very quickly into Solution Explorer with everything unloaded, and you can then basically right-click and start loading the project you want to work on. So that you can get in there really quickly and start working on the code. If you need to build things, you have a few options. You can right-click on the project you're working on, and you can tell Visual Studio to go and load all of its direct dependencies, or in fact, go and load all dependencies. And at that point, Visual Studio will load up all of the projects that are required to do the build of the project that you're working on, which again is likely to be a subset of the whole solution. And therefore, you can not only move around the environment quicker, but your builds can be very significantly faster because you've only got part of the solution loaded at that point in time. Another thing we've done recently, and there was a lot of information published about this at the time and various YouTube videos, so again, I'll just mention it briefly and point you at those, is we added a whole new unit testing framework for Synergy, or for traditional Synergy. We've already had the unit testing framework for .NET. Again, this was in the 11.11d release. It's based on MS Test, so it works basically the same way the .NET solution does. It ships as part of SDI, and it uses the Visual Studio Test Explorer in the exact same way that the unit testing within .NET projects works. We've also got a new project template, so if you do a file new project or add project, you'll see a traditional Synergy unit testing project template to get you started. This really is just a sort of a shout out for Visual Studio and an encouragement for everybody to consider using it if you're not already. Visual Studio is not just a tool for Windows development anymore. A few years ago it was, but a lot of effort has gone in at Synergex to make this the IDE of choice for any Synergy development, essentially. A lot of this has to do with version control as well, and the fact that a lot of us are now using version control systems, and quite likely cloud-based version control systems. A lot of us are moving to tools like Azure DevOps and using the Git version control that comes with that. And we can do an awful lot of integration across, our development systems, our Windows and Linux and Unix systems, through the version control system, so we can work on the source code in one place in Visual Studio on Windows and have it deployed to all of those different systems. But also those advanced DevOps tools that we've heard a lot about in the last conference and we will hear more about in this conference can also help you set up advanced environments that take care of building the product on Linux and Unix and Windows remote systems, and even OpenVMS. OpenVMS is the one system that is difficult to synchronize source code with through version control systems. So we've invented a new solution to that, which I'll talk to you about in another solution. But we do have a solution for synchronizing code from a Windows environment to OpenVMS. And then you can even use, Azure DevOps build pipelines, for example, to fire off builds on those remote systems, including VMS. So I would encourage you, if you're not already using Visual Studio for your development, and Windows and Linux is kind of a no-brainer because it's binary compatible as well. The older enterprise Unixes and OpenVMS are a little bit harder. There's a few extra steps to go through, but it's very doable, and there's some great advantages to doing so. And again, you'll see more information in subsequent sessions. I'm not going to linger on this slide very long. We always put this slide up there, and you can pause and review it later if you wish. And this is all in the documentation. These are just the minimum platform versions that we require for Synergy 11. So, for example, Synergy 11 supports Windows 8 and higher, and so on. So I'll just leave that slide there for a couple of seconds, and you can go and find your platform and make sure you're good for your upgrade. Other requirements, Synergy upgrades on Windows. If you want to upgrade to Synergy 11 on Windows, the minimum version you can do that from is Synergy 9.3.1. So if you do happen to be on an earlier version than 9.3.1 and want to get straight to 11, you have to go through 9.3.1 as an intermediate. So if you're on 8.5, for example, then upgrade from 8.5 to 9.3.1, and then you'd have to do a second operation to upgrade to version 11. The minimum ISAM revision, as it has been for a while, is ISAM Rev 4, although I would encourage, if you've got older Rev 4 ISAM files out there, I can't encourage you strongly enough to go and spend the time to patch those files up to the latest ISAM revisions. There are so many new features that you can take advantage of from version 10 and version 11 and continuing, and the performance in some of those operations that I talked about earlier. It's not available to you if you're in ISAM Rev 4, but you just need to get up to Rev 6 to get advantage to all of that, to take advantage of all of those latest and greatest tools and performance. And the minimum Visual Studio we currently support is Visual Studio 2017, although that's going to change soon. We'll talk about that a little bit more towards the end of the presentation. In terms of relational databases, the minimum version of SQL Server for SQL Connection is SQL Server 2012 and Oracle 12. And bear in mind, we did recently add support. Here it is. I thought it was. We added support for MySQL, both MySQL 5 and 8.4, but only on 64-bit systems. Let's talk about some policy changes now. So that's pretty much everything that's happened in the product in the last period since the last conference. We've also had some policy changes specifically to do with patches. We have been, as you saw on my first slide, we've had 11.1.1a and B and C and D and E and so on with those patch letters. In the past, we had a strict policy about what we were and were not allowed to do in what we called patch releases. Essentially, we were not allowed to introduce new functionality in those patch releases. And over time, as we became more agile in the way we develop software, we became kind of unintentionally agile in the way we release it as well. And we got into some bad habits. So we have decided to address that. The advantages of doing that are it gets new features out to you guys faster. The disadvantages of doing that is that because we're including new features in those patches, we've got new code with new bugs. New code, we all know, tends to have more bugs than existing code that's been well tested and used for a long time. So by introducing new code, you make the product inherently less stable, typically. So the new policy is we're reverting back to our previous policy, where patches to the product are for quality improvement only. This took effect as of Synergy 11.1.1f. So the F and G releases have both only contained patches, and we have seen a difference already. If you look back at the cadence of those patch releases, you'll notice that they've slowed down quite a bit since F. In fact, F was, we've only had 2 in the last 10, 11 months, I think. And that's somewhat to do with that change. So patch releases from now on are only for bug fixes and anything that's necessary for security. Having said that, we're also going to change the way we release software. Currently, we have kind of an ad hoc release cycle based on features and when they come along and when we get things finished, pretty much. And we also have kind of an indeterminate support cycle in terms of, we say that we will carry on supporting, and that really means fixing bugs if you find problems, the current major version and the previous major version. But because we don't have a fixed cycle, that you can't really translate that into, if I take this version, I know it's going to be supported for X number of years. You can probably look at averages and get a feel, but there's no way of knowing. The new policy is that from the next Synergy release, which, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, is going to be Synergy 12.1, and it's going to be in the November timeframe of this year. We're going to go to the same pattern that a lot of the operating system people and major tools platforms like .NET use, and that is what's called an LTS release, or a long-term support release mechanism. So an LTS release, the idea is it's a well-tested, stable platform with a predetermined release cadence and a predetermined support period. And I'll talk to you about what those cadence and periods are on the next slide. Between those LTS releases, we'll be doing what's called interim or feature releases. So the feature releases are going to come much more often, much more quickly, more similar to what we've been doing with the patch releases in the past. But essentially, it's a separate channel that you can opt into if you really want to get access to the latest and greatest things that we're working on and the things that are going to become part of the next long-term release. So that's what the feature release stream is for. As I mentioned, the first long-term support release will be Synergy 12.1 in November of this year. So a little bit more information about these types of releases. An LTS release, the idea is that it's a consistent feature set. So the total emphasis on LTS releases is with stability of the platform and stability of the version and the product. So once an LTS release is made public, no new features will be added to that code base once it is released. Okay, that doesn't mean we won't be issuing updates to that product. So 12.1 will receive updates, but those updates, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, will only contain any necessary quality improvements or things that are necessary for security, encryption, that kind of thing, things that change, in external dependencies that we have for doing encryption and things of that nature. The cadence for LTS releases will be every 2 years approximately. So we will be releasing 12.1 in November of this year. The next LTS release will be in approximately the November timeframe 2 years later in 2023, and so on. Once we publish an LTS release, we will commit to support that release for the longer of either 4 years minimum or 1 year after the next LTS release, okay, whichever is the longer, okay? So if we do slide a little bit with the LTS release, it can be taken into account in our support periods. The versioning schemes for the LTS releases, we've already said that the first release will be 12.1. It will be 12.1 point something, but that something will not be a sequentially incrementing number. It will be a build number, not a version number. So the LTS version will be 12.1 followed by a build number. Okay, so the first build might be 12.1.1 if we rebuild it and are able to release it without finding any last-minute issues, in the product. But it might not be. It might be that 12.1.9 is the first 12.1 release because it's build number 9. Okay, that might be a little bit weird. And the next release, any updates to 12.1 will be just 12.1 point higher build number. Okay, there will be no more patch letters once we start this approach. Feature releases, on the other hand, as I already mentioned, are your way of getting early access to new features. So as soon as we release an LTS release, we will already have in mind pretty much what are we going to work on for the next one. It may not be set in stone, it may not be a published absolute roadmap, but we'll have a good idea of what's next for the next LTS. And we will immediately start working forward towards that in the feature releases. And we'll release those new features as and when they become ready or as and when they become usable. It might not be 100% of a particular feature, it might be 80% of it, but it's usable. Okay, so that's what a feature release is. The cadence of a feature, they'll still be tested, but in the feature releases, that's where all the new code is. So again, higher chance of things being found that need addressing, bugs, in the feature release branch versus the LTS release where no new code is being added at all. We're just fixing any issues that may come along. We'll still be doing testing, and it'll be best efforts for best stability, but there are no updates in this world. You just take the next LTS release that comes along. Okay, so again, there's no patch letters in this world anymore. The support period for a feature release will be much shorter. Basically, it will be 3 months after the next feature or LTS release. We will no longer support the previous feature release. So this is kind of like, think Windows Update, think Windows Insider. You know, it comes, you tell it, you can have fast ring or slow ring, but once it's there, it's there. It's going to get installed on your machine. You need to keep up. If you elect for that path, you need to stay on the latest version and keep up. And the versioning scheme within the feature releases will be even build numbers. So the LTS releases will be 12.1, 12.3, 12.5. The feature releases between them will be 12.0 leading up to the 12.1 feature release, 12.2 leading up to the 12.3 feature release, and so on. It's a very similar scheme that we used to use for our beta releases back in the day when we had formal beta test programs. The even numbers were always the beta tests. What about SDI moving forward? SDI is not part of this whole scheme. We've been doing regular SDI releases for a long time now. We used to call them developer releases. We no longer do. Initially, they were perhaps less well tested, but every time we do an SDI release, it is fully tested and fully qualified. And this is just another release, and we've been doing that for over a year now. And that will continue. So the SDI versioning scheme and release scheme will not be tied to SDE anymore. In fact, to make this difference clear, we're actually going to go to a whole new numbering scheme. So the SDI numbering scheme is going to be year-based. So like Visual Studio 2017 and 19 and so on, our SDI is going to be year.month.build number. So the next one, if it were next month, might be 2021.06.build number. So it'll be year-month based. And again, we encourage you, remember you can do runtime version targeting. So no matter what version of SDI you're using, you can target those older runtime versions. So there's no reason not to keep up. In addition to all of the product changes we've been making, we've also been doing some work on our web infrastructure. We've done a lot of work on the Resource Center. This is the current screenshot of the Resource Center homepage. I'm not going to give you a lot of information about it, just to point out that we've done a lot of work on it, and that work continues, so go take a look. Several months ago now, we replaced the product downloads page with a whole new experience. And very recently, we've replaced the knowledge base. This was the final large piece to move out of the old Resource Center. Much better, much easier to use. Again, go check it out online. Very briefly, let's just mention OpenVMS as well. HPE are now completely out of the OpenVMS business. That includes selling hardware, licensing, and support. They're no longer involved in any way. VSI continues to develop towards their x86 solution. But really, that is not a reality as yet. They've recently released VMS 8.4-2L3, which is a patch update for integrity systems only, and standard support for all earlier versions of VSI releases ends on December 31st, 2022. Currently, it's not possible to purchase any new hardware to deploy OpenVMS systems on. The VSI x86 port continues. The first production of this is going to be OpenVMS version 9.2, and their roadmap currently states late 2021. That's not far away yet, and they haven't even gone to public beta, which is 9.1 yet. So I think a lot of people expect that perhaps not to happen in that time frame. That first release, 9.2, will be on a single specific HP server, the DL380, and we're told will support VirtualBox, KVM, and VMware hypervisors. Where is Synergy in regard to OpenVMS x86? The honest answer is we don't know yet. We, about a year ago now, surveyed all of our OpenVMS customers, and were fairly surprised to find very little interest in moving their VMS applications to a VMS on x86 platform. Even if we wanted to, it's not technically feasible right now. There is still no C++ compiler available for OpenVMS. So if you have any C++ code, which almost everybody does, then you are dead in the water at this point anyway. So right now, there's nothing we can do. But we are officially undecided. So that's the update we have for OpenVMS at this point in time. Let's talk about roadmap briefly. Where are we going to go next? Basically, we've already mentioned that the next release of Synergy will be Synergy 12.1, the first LTS release in November. Synergy 12.1 will be largely about supporting .NET 6, which is, the whole completion of the evolution of .NET Core to replace .NET Framework. So .NET Core 3.1 overtook .NET Framework 4.8, which is now a stable product or a mature product, and became .NET 5.0, which is the current release. 5.0 is not an LTS release. .NET 6 is their first LTS release of this new .NET Core taking over from .NET Framework, and that's what we're targeting. So Synergy 12.1 will be largely about supporting .NET 6 across all of the places that .NET and Synergy touch, and there are lots and lots of them. All the libraries like DDLib and SynXML, all the APIs that work on Synergy.NET and in traditional Synergy, all of the statements that work in Synergy.NET and traditional Synergy and do different things to the underlying subsystems. We'll have a new XF Netlink client for .NET Core, which will be based on a NuGet package. In fact, that already exists. So if anybody's doing .NET Core web development today or development generally and wants to use XF Netlink.NET in that environment, we do have a solution to that several customers have already been provided with. And we're also going to be completing our support for .NET Standard 2.0. We can support .NET Standard 2.0 by creating a class library, for example, but parts of Synergy are just not available when you do that. We want to complete that so that when you create a .NET Standard 2.0 library, the whole of Synergy is available to you, like it would be if you selected a .NET Framework assembly. The first LTS release, in addition, Synergy General stuff, we are going to be moving away from OpenSSL on the Windows platform. We're going to be moving to the more native Microsoft Secure Channel, which is part of the Windows operating system. So that will solve an awful lot of deployment problems with OpenSSL for a lot of people on Windows. So that will affect everywhere that does encryption. So the language, HTTP, XF Server Plus, SQL Connection, ODBC, all of those products will use the new Windows Microsoft Secure Channel instead of OpenSSL. We're looking at a new ISUtil option to allow you to clear the contents of an ISAM file like the old ISLoad clear option used to do. It's one of the few things that ISUtil doesn't do that it really needs to. We're looking at the possibility of distributing Windows hotfixes or Windows hotfixes as installers. So when we emergency provide you with a solution, we'd like to provide you with a runnable installer for that solution rather than a batch file and a zip file and so on. That may or may not make it into the first LTS. That's one of the things that might be in danger of slipping. We're also looking at implementing a TCP/IP-based license manager for Linux. So basically the same way Windows works. In fact, Linux systems would be a client to a Windows license server. So if you want to use that function, and again, it would be optional, but if you want to have network licensing served to a Linux system, and that particularly is going to help people who are trying to run Synergy stuff inside containers, Linux containers, Whereas now you can't really do it. You can't really get there because you have to, when you bring the container into existence, it has to be licensed. Now you can just point it as an IP address to get its license. And we're looking at several new .NET language features just to keep in parity with C# and some new things that have happened in recent versions of C# and some specific things we're looking at there. Visual Studio integration, of course, will continue. We intend to add WinForms and WPF project support for .NET 6, although there is currently a blocker on us doing so from Microsoft. They don't currently allow third-party languages to play in that park at this point in time. Excuse me. So we are trying to work on that, and we will deliver that if we are able to. We are going to be adding a UI Toolkit window library project to Visual Studio. This is something that came from the Ideas Forum, and I think is probably the most voted on idea that we've ever had. So thank you for that. We're going to be adding Visual Studio Test Explorer support for .NET 6 unit test projects, and we're also going to be migrating to Visual Studio 2022. This is just very recently announced by Microsoft. It's a major change to Visual Studio. It's going to be 64-bit for the first time ever. It's always been 32-bit. And at that point, our support will be for Visual Studio 2022 and 2019. So for Synergy 12, there will not be support for Visual Studio 2017. So I'd recommend that. I know there's not many of you out there now that are still on that old version. Microsoft defocused development for it quite some time ago, and it's not in great shape generally. Even with C# these days, there's a lot of, with .NET Core particularly, there's a lot of stuff that just doesn't work well in 2017 already. So good time to upgrade. Other things for the first LTS release, things that we hope to include, but may or may not be able to, depending on how things work out. We want to add enforcement for HTTP, for the HTTP API when you're using an SSL certificate. Currently, if you don't provide a CA file to say this is who we trust, then we just trust everybody, essentially, which is not great. So we hope to address that. We're looking at adding some paging operations to the select class. And we're also looking at optimizing both the HTTP and socket APIs on Windows by removing, currently we do a bunch of Win32 interop, and we want to remove that and go to native interfaces instead. Also, we're looking at implementing message box, print query, and print setup dialogues for .NET 6. Again, that may or may not make it into the initial release. For Visual Studio, initially what we're looking at doing, a lot of people working particularly in things like Harmony Core projects, but also generally are working with repository schema files a lot more than actually working with the repository UI. So we want to improve the experience of that in Visual Studio. Initially, for the first release, for the LTS release, we will be adding colorization for repository schema files, and full fidelity editing with full IntelliSense is coming, but it won't be in the first in the LTS release. Version timeline and goal I've already mentioned. Synergy 12.1 in November 2021. For the first, beyond that, the first LTS patch that we envisage will include any necessary quality or security patches to 12.1 if there's anything crops up with the initial LTS release that needs fixing. But beyond that, remember, we're not allowed to introduce new features, so it's bug fixes. One thing we will be doing in the first LTS patch, and this may seem slightly strange, is we'll be adding support for .NET 6 on Linux. Okay, but when you think about it, that's not a new feature. It's an entire new platform, and that's okay. We can add support for new platforms in LTS releases. We just can't change features. So .NET 6 support on Linux will be coming in, we hope, the first patch to 12.1. And we're shooting for, some people might shoot me for saying this, but we're shooting for late Q1 next year. It might slip into Q2 at some point, but basically the first release after the LTS, we're very much hoping to support Synergy.net on Linux, and that will be huge for a lot of people. If you want to host Harmony Core services, for example, without a Windows server, if you're a Linux customer with Linux data and Linux business logic, then that will let you run those Harmony Core services directly on that Linux server without a Windows server being involved. Beyond that, we don't really know. It's a little bit less, it's a little bit more fluffy. Anything that doesn't make it into the LTS will drop down into the feature release branches. But what are we going to be doing beyond that? We don't know fully, but we've got a lot of ideas. We've got more things we want to do in ISAM, features and enhancements and performance improvements. We've got some select class changes that we want to make. We're thinking of potentially doing support for group by type operations. We're going to be looking at XF server client failover. So again, high availability being important. Looking at ways of if this server goes away, let's swap connections over to another server and carry on, that kind of thing. Full IntelliSense for repository schema files in Visual Studio, as I mentioned. We're also looking at what metrics we can track. A lot of you, as you consider moving towards the cloud, need information about what your application does to its server, how many IOs, how much memory, how much CPU, and so on. So we're looking at adding tracking of those kind of things into the runtime environments so that you can extract and report on that kind of information. We'd like to get to the point where we have a single developer tools installation that has all of the development tools on Windows at least, and then a separate, very small, very lightweight runtime only installation. And we're still considering consolidating 32 and 64-bit Windows installations into one installer if we can. And that's something we'll be looking at going forward. Again, these are some of many ideas. These are not commitments. These are just things that we're thinking of and things that some of them are bubbling to the top of the pot at this point in time. But we're very much looking for your feedback on some of this stuff as well. Here's my final slide, just re-emphasizing that. As well as changing how we develop products with our agile transformation that we've almost completed at this point, and changing, how we release our products, we're also trying to change how we plan for our new products. And we want and need your input. We've done a lot over the last 18 months or so now. We've had a lot of online customer meetings on a regular basis. We've done a lot of webinars. We've been doing, this conferences. We've had a summit in the not too distant past. We're trying to be proactive in talking to you, our customers, and we would ask you and invite you to be proactive with us and tell us what you need and what you expect. We very much want to hear it. Good places to do that is the Resource Center Ideas Forum. That's the best place because everybody gets to see it and comment on it and vote for it. But please, if there's something you want to talk to us about, feel free to ask your account executive to schedule a meeting, either with me or whoever it is you feel it's most appropriate you want to speak to in the organization. And feel free to email me at any point in time about anything related to the product set. My email address is right there on the slide. With that, I would like to invite any questions that you may have.
We've had some great questions in the chat already. I'm just going to go ahead and forget that slide. But we've had some great things in the chat already, and Steve has been kind enough to be answering them, so that's awesome. But if you have another question, please put it in the chat, and you can also raise your hand, and we'll call on you. If you raise your hand and want to talk, we will switch you from view mode to interactive mode, and you'll be able to unmute yourself and speak. So Steve, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Sure. The only one that's not been answered so far is from Stuart. Is OpenSSL 1.11 baked into the product, or does it link out to external libraries? Yes, it does link out to external libraries, but we do have strong linkages to certain versions. So for 1.11 support, you do have to be on Synergy 11, but we do not ship that in the product. What else have we got out here? Just to review a few of the others that have already been answered until we get any new ones. Kevin asked why Synergy, Kevin Faulkner asked why Synergy DE doesn't support Unicode. We have done some customers have successfully supported 16-bit characters and Unicode characters in their applications by setting up subroutines and functions to do input using an A2 for storage of each character. So you can certainly get there from here to a certain extent. The one area you tend to run into problems fairly quickly is if you need to use that for keys. So there has been some discussion recently about whether we can add support for UTF-16 based keys, and that's an ongoing discussion. And something certainly I'd welcome input on that in the ideas forum if anybody feels strongly about that. I know there's a number of customers that already do that kind of thing. Can any tools be used for automation testing for DBL code in VMS? As I've mentioned briefly in the presentation, we do have this utility called VMS File Sync, which uses an SSH tunnel to send commands and files through SFTP or FTPS and also an SSH tunnel to send commands. So that can be used to implement remote builds on VMS that you can automate from DevOps pipelines and things like that. Dave Overbeck asked if the support for not requiring root permissions to start XF Server Plus was including VMS. Actually, Dave, unfortunately, that work was not done on OpenVMS, but in discussing it with some of my colleagues, it could be done, and we will give that some more consideration in the near future. What else have we got here? There's a new one. Let's just pop back over there. Unit tests, do we provide a boilerplate for ISAM resilient routines? No, we don't, Stuart, but that is an interesting idea. So let me give that some thought, and we'll maybe get back to you on that. I'd like to maybe chat with you about what you would be looking for there. So maybe we can discuss that offline. It sounds like an interesting idea. Did I understand correctly that new UI toolkit Visual Studio tools will be released in November 2021? The only thing that we're releasing to do with UI toolkit in Visual Studio is support for a window library project type. So you'll be able to set up a project type to house your WSC files, and very much like the way a repository project works, when that project is built, it will create the window library for you. That's the only thing we're changing there. I saw where COM+ pooling is gone in .NET Core implementation of XF Netlink. We really enjoy the speed and performance of pooled connections. What's the technical equivalent that we can use in .NET Core? Actually, we've already, Jeff, when he implemented the .NET Core version of xfnetlink.net, which is not a released part of the product yet, but is available. We can get it to you if several customers are already using it. He did also put together a sample of how to implement a pooling mechanism that essentially replaces the COM+ pooling. So although there is no COM+ pooling in .NET Core, but we have provided, similar to the way we did with Java back in the day, an example of how to do that, Tom.